October 14, 1943, 14:31 hours, 22,000 feet over Bavaria. The escort fighters are gone. They turned back 2 hours ago, near Aachen. Their fuel gauges left them no choice. Now 229 B-17 flying fortresses are crossing southern Germany without a single friendly fighter within 200 miles, and the 109s know it. They have known it for 40 minutes. By the time the formations reach, 60 bombers are down, 600 men, in one afternoon. The 306th Bomb Group loses 10 aircraft out of 16 dispatched. The loss rate for the mission clears 20%. The Army Air Forces allows for 2. 8th Bomber Command quietly suspends deep penetration raids into Germany. There is no announcement. There doesn't need to be. In London, 5 months earlier, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named climbed out of a P-51 with an engine and wrote 3 pages. He handed them to his supervisor. The low-altitude performance is remarkable, but above 15,000 feet, the is simply gasping. The supervisor looked at the report. Then it's a tactical aircraft, not a strategic one. Didn't answer. He looked back at the aircraft on the tarmac, at the clean belly, the smooth lines under the fuselage, the shallow duct that no other fighter carried. Then he went home and wrote 4 more pages addressed directly to the Air Ministry. He was right about he was wrong about the conclusion. Here are the numbers that matter. October 1943, 60 B-17s in a single day, 600 men, the bombing campaign on the edge of collapse. March 6, 1944, 730 bombers over Berlin. P-51 Mustangs on their wing the entire route, full fuel for combat on arrival. Had told that the physics of range made this impossible. He had the mathematics. He had the intelligence reports. He had every reason to be confident. The man who proved him wrong was born 40 miles from the German border. The doctrine had a name. The bomber will always get through. Air Marshal coined it in the 1920s, and by 1943 it had calcified into institutional gospel on both sides of the Atlantic. The logic was simple. A formation of heavy bombers, flying high and fast, armed with enough machine guns, could defend itself against any fighter attack. The B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13 50 caliber guns. Stacked in tight defensive boxes, the formations created interlocking fields of fire that, on paper, made a fighter pilot's approach suicidal. The Luftwaffe spent 6 months figuring out the paper was wrong. By mid-1943, German fighter controllers had identified the precise geometry of the B-17 formation. The nose was armored. The top turret was lethal. But the approach from dead ahead, slightly below at closing speeds above 500, gave a deflection angle that the turret gunners couldn't track. Fighter wings JG-1, JG-2, and JG-26 refined the tactic through the summer. They called it the frontal attack. In the August 17 raid-on, the lead groups of the 1st Bombardment Division absorbed this attack in sequence. Loss rates in the leading elements reached 24% in a single pass. The self-escorting fortress had met its answer, and the answer flew at 360 straight through the nose. 8th Bomber Command tried 3 times to solve the range problem before the answer arrived. Attempt 1. Modify the P-47 Thunderbolt. Republic's fighter was fast and tough, but it burned fuel the way a furnace burns wood. Engineers fitted external 200-gallon drop tanks under the belly. The result was an escort radius of roughly 800 miles round trip. Enough to reach Aachen from the English bases, enough to get the bombers across the Dutch coast and into the western edge of Germany. At 250 miles deeper, the P-47s hit their fuel limit and turned back. The bombers flew the last 2 hours alone. The modification bought miles, not enough miles. Attempt 2. Deploy the P-38 Lightning. The twin engine had the range, in theory, up to 1,300 miles with drop tanks. Over North Africa and the Pacific, P-38s had performed well. Over Germany in winter, they fell apart. The engines ran on oil that thickened in European cold at high altitude. At 25,000 feet over central Germany in December 1943, the left engine on a P-38 did not fail dramatically. It simply started losing power. Slowly, then completely. Pilots learned to watch the oil temperature gauge the way a man watches a water level in a boat. The engine problem grounded dozens of missions and killed pilots who had nothing to do with enemy action. At combat maneuvering altitudes above 20,000 feet, Experienced Luftwaffe pilots in 109 found the P-38 manageable. The range existed, the reliability did not. Attempt 3. Accept the losses and press on. After the August raids, 8th Air Force commanders reviewed the attrition figures and concluded that the rate was unsustainable but not immediately fatal. If the bombing campaign destroyed enough German industrial capacity fast enough, the losses would become acceptable in retrospect. The October 14 raid was partly a test of this theory. 60 bombers did not come back. The theory was retired that afternoon. 3 attempts, 3 failures measured in aircraft and men. The answer was already built. It sat on the tarmac at North American Aviation's Inglewood, California facility, and it had been there since October 1940. Edgar was a German-born engineer who had worked at before emigrating to the United States in 1931. North American's chief designer, he had drawn the NUS-73X prototype in 102 days, from signed contract to flying aircraft, using a laminar flow wing profile that the NACA had published and most manufacturers had ignored. The profile was different from every other fighter flying. The leading edge was thicker than standard, the point of maximum thickness pushed further back, the surface tolerances held to specifications than most factories considered practical. The result was 10 to 15% less drag than a conventional wing at cruise speeds. Knew what he had built. The problem was the engine sitting in it. The V-1710 produced adequate power below 15,000 feet. Above that altitude, it lost compression, and the P-51 became a different aircraft, slower, heavier on the controls, unable to match a 109 at the heights where the bombers flew. The British evaluated the early P-51s and assigned them to low-altitude Army cooperation duties. The aircraft's potential ceiling sat unused. On April 30, 1942, flew one and wrote his report. He noted the performance at low altitude. He noted the structural quality. Then he wrote the sentence that changed the calculation. The P-51 airframe, fitted with a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, would likely produce an aircraft superior to any single-engine fighter in service. The report went to the Air Ministry and from there, slowly over 6 months, to a Rolls-Royce conversion program that fitted 4 prototype Mustangs with Merlin engines. The results came back in October 1942. Maximum speed, 441. High-altitude performance, matched the Spitfire IX. The ceiling had been a ceiling. The Merlin removed it. The third man in this chain was Tommy Hitchcock, polo player, World War I veteran, lieutenant colonel attached to the U.S. Embassy in London. Hitchcock flew the Merlin-converted Mustang and wrote his own report, this one addressed to the War Department in Washington. I believe that this aircraft is the answer to our need for a long-range fighter, and that it should be adopted by the U.S. Army Air Forces as a matter of urgency. The report circulated. Hitchcock. He found the right offices and the right officers and made the argument that the motor car company in Detroit already held a license to produce the Merlin under the designation V-1650. The supply chain existed. The conversion would not require importing engines from Derby. It required a production decision. The decision came slowly, too slowly for the crews flying to. But by November 1943, the first P-51 with Merlins were landing at bases in East. The aircraft carried something else that German intelligence had not anticipated and had not accounted for in their range calculations. An 85-gallon fuel tank installed directly behind the cockpit, inside the fuselage. It shifted the center of gravity so far aft that North American's own engineers considered the configuration dangerous. Pilots who flew a full fuselage tank described the aircraft as reluctant, slow to respond, unwilling to commit to a maneuver. The standing order was absolute. Burn that tank first, before crossing into German airspace before any possibility of combat. Never fight with it full. German range assessments for the P-51 were based on the standard fuel configuration. The fuselage tank did not appear in the early specifications that Luftwaffe intelligence had captured. Their calculation of the P-51's operational radius was short by roughly 300 miles. 300 miles was the distance to Berlin. Lieutenant Colonel Don climbed into his P-51B at Essex at 6:15 hours and ran the pre-flight checks by feel. He had flown 400 combat hours in 3 years. He knew the instrument panel the way a man knows his own kitchen in the dark. The fuselage tank behind his seat held 85 gallons. The aircraft sat tail-heavy, nose slightly elevated, the controls already communicating their reluctance through the stick. He had briefed his pilots on this an hour earlier. Burn the fuselage tank first, no exceptions, before the Dutch coast disappears behind you. If a German fighter finds you with that tank above half full, you will not be able to answer him. The 4th Fighter Group launched 36 P-51s into a gray English morning. The temperature at altitude would be -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The mission order called for rendezvous with the bomber stream over the North Sea, escort to target, escort home. The target was Berlin. This was the first time those words appeared together in an operations order. Wheels up at 6:15 hours. The Merlin engine, 1,490 horsepower, 12 cylinders, supercharged, pulled the aircraft off the runway and into cloud cover at 2,000 feet. Held formation heading east, climbing through overcast. The fuselage tank read full. He flew level, deliberately, making no sharp inputs. The aircraft answered every control movement with a half-second delay that felt longer. 90 minutes out, at 7:45 hours, rendezvous over the North Sea. 730 bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, flew in combat boxes stretching 94 miles from front to rear. The formations occupied a corridor of sky so wide that the trailing groups could not see the leading groups through the overcast. P-51s took position on the near flanks. Drop tanks went off over the Dutch coast. The aircraft immediately climbed 200 feet as the weight fell away. The fuselage tank still read above half. He flew straight. 2 hours and 40 minutes out, at 8:55 hours, the German border. The fuselage tank read below a quarter. Burned the last of it in a long, level cruise segment over Westphalia and felt the aircraft change under him. The center of gravity moved forward by 6 inches. The stick came alive. The P-51 that had been sluggish and deliberate for the last 2.5 hours became the aircraft he knew. He ran a quick scan. Fuel in the wing tanks, ammunition full, engine temperature normal. He was 280 miles from Berlin with a fighting aircraft. The first 109s appeared at 9:12 hours, 6 aircraft climbing through the bomber stream from below in a standard frontal attack approach. Called them out and led his section down in a diving intercept. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. 2 109s went down. The remaining 4 broke off east and did not return. The bombers held formation. 4 hours and 10 minutes out, at 10:25 hours Berlin. The bomber formations crossed the outer defense ring at 27,000 feet. Below them, 300 anti-aircraft batteries opened up. The flak appeared as black smudges at altitude, irregular, persistent, accurate enough that the formation commanders held their headings rigidly rather than weave. P-51s flew above the flak ceiling, watching for fighters. The 109s and FW-190s that rose to meet the bombers found P-51s already above them. The engagement over the city lasted 22 minutes. When the last bomb group cleared the target and turned west, 4th Fighter Group had expended 2/3 of its ammunition and was still carrying fuel. That last detail was the one no German controller had planned for. 4 hours and 55 minutes out, at 11:10 hours west of Berlin on the outbound leg. Checked his fuel state, wing tanks at 60%. He had enough to escort the bombers to the Dutch border and still reach with a reserve. He relayed the fuel check to his section leaders. The replies came back within 30 seconds. The group was intact, armed, fueled. They stayed with the bombers. 7 hours and 15 minutes out, at 13:30 hours, wheels down at, taxied to dispersal and shut down the engine. The crew chief noted the fuel remaining, 38 gallons in the left wing tank, 41 in the right. He had crossed Germany, fought over Berlin, and come home with enough fuel to fly another 90 minutes. Inside the bomber formations, the gunners had spent the inbound leg scanning for the moment the escort would turn back. On every previous depenetration mission, there was a moment, always somewhere over the Western Reich, always announced by the fighters waggling their wings before banking away, when the B-17 crews understood they were alone for the next 2 hours. Gunners rotated to their positions. Pilots tightened the formation spacing. The tail gunners began watching the 6 o'clock position with a specific quality of attention that was different from normal vigilance. On March 6, the moment did not come. Staff Sergeant Walter, a waist gunner in the 91st Bomb Group flying in the 3rd Combat Box, tracked the P-51s on the southern flank from the Dutch coast all the way to the German border, and then kept watching. At 8:55 hours, still over Germany, he called his pilot on to confirm that the fighters were still there. The pilot confirmed. At 9:30 hours, with the formation 150 miles inside Germany, checked again. Still there. At 10:20 hours, crossing the outer Berlin defense ring with flak already appearing at altitude, the P-51s were overhead, higher than the bombers, moving fast along the flanks. Had flown 14 missions. He had never seen a fighter still present at this point in a route. He said nothing over the. He watched the P-51 silhouettes, the long nose, the elliptical radiator scoop under the belly, and kept his hands on the 50 caliber mount. 12 minutes later, a flight of FW-190s made a pass at the northern edge of his box from 2 o'clock high. Before the formation's top turret gunners could track them, 2 P-51s came down through the FW-190s from above and broke the attack before it developed. The FW-190s scattered. The box held its heading. Watched the P-51s climb back to altitude and take station again on the flank. He filed a brief note in his mission debrief that afternoon. Friendly fighters present at target, engaged enemy, remained with formation on return leg. The intelligence officer who transcribed the debrief stopped at that line and read it back to him. Confirmed it. The officer wrote it down. Across 47 aircraft in the 91st Bomb Group that afternoon, 11 separate debrief reports mentioned the same observation. The escort stayed. At 8th Air Force Headquarters in High, the duty officer processed the first mission reports at 1400 hours and walked them to General Jimmy's office. Read the 4th Fighter Group summary twice. The P-51s had made Berlin. They had fought over the city. They had come back. He initialed the report and handed it back without comment. The staff officer asked if there was anything else. Said there was not. The following morning, he issued orders expanding P-51 operations to all available fighter groups in the 8th Air Force. The priority was no longer escort. The priority was the destruction of the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. At Luftwaffe Fighter Command's Forward Operations Center, 15 miles west of Berlin, the duty controller had been tracking the incoming formation since 8:30 hours. The radar returns were clear. A large bomber stream on a direct heading for the capital, escorted. Standard intercept doctrine called for fighter units to climb ahead of the stream, position above and to the east, and attack the bombers during the bomb run when the formations were most constrained. JG-300 launched 48 aircraft at 9:40 hours. JG-1 put up 31 more from fields south of the city. The controller's plot showed the escort fighters on the northern flank. Single engine. The return signature was consistent with a P-47. It was always a P-47 this far into Germany because nothing else had the range. He assigned JG-300's high cover to deal with the escort while JG-1 went for the bombers. JG-300 made contact at 10:28 hours, 30 miles northwest of Berlin. The engagement report that came back confused the operations staff. The escort had not broken off to protect the bombers. The escort had climbed, turned into the attack and stayed. When JG-300's pilots broke off and attempted to reach their own airfields to refuel and rearm, 2 P-51s followed them down to low altitude and attacked them in the landing pattern. This had never happened before. No Allied fighter had ever followed a German aircraft to its home field. The fuel calculations did not allow for it. The controller called the unit command post directly. He needed the aircraft type confirmed. The response came back in 4 minutes. P-51 Mustang. Long-nosed, squared wingtip underwing radiator duct, not a P-47. The controller asked about the fuel state of the American aircraft at the time of the engagement. The responding officer said the P-51s had appeared to have full tactical discretion. They were maneuvering freely, pursuing aggressively, not conserving for the return leg. He added that one P-51 had fired on a 109 attempting to land at a field 10 minutes of flying time from central Berlin. If the American was attacking there, he had already been over the city, fought, and still had fuel for pursuit. The controller wrote up his assessment and flagged it for Luftwaffe High Command. At this headquarters, the report sat in the duty officer's inbox for 3 hours. Nobody in the chain wanted to be the one who brought it upstairs. Had promised publicly that no enemy aircraft would appear over Berlin. He had given that assurance not as a prediction but as a guarantee built on physics and distance and the known limitations of Allied technology. The report now sitting in the inbox said the guarantee was wrong. The duty officer eventually passed it up at 1700 hours. The initial response from staff was a request for confirmation from a second source. The pilots had made an identification error. The long-nosed aircraft was a P-47 with a modified cowling. The fuel state had been misread in the confusion of combat. A pilot under fire does not make precise measurements of enemy fuel consumption. The request for second confirmation went out to JG-1's operations officer, who had 31 pilots with direct visual contact over a period of 22 minutes and 3 sets of gun camera footage. The confirmation came back the same evening. The duty officer filed it and went home. Tommy Hitchcock did not see Berlin. He died on April 18, 1944, 6 weeks after the mission he had spent 2 years making possible. The aircraft was a P-51B on a test flight over Salisbury Plain. The cause was never definitively established. The aircraft entered a steep dive at low altitude and did not recover. Hitchcock was 44 years old. He had flown in the Lafayette Escadrille in the First War, been shot down, escaped a German prisoner of war camp on foot, and spent the years between the wars as the best polo player in the United States. He had used every connection he possessed to move the Merlin Mustang program through Washington procurement channels at a speed those channels were not designed for. He was buried before the aircraft he championed decided the air war over Germany. The mathematics of what his lobbying produced can be stated in 2 numbers. In October 1943, the month of the disaster, the 8th Air Force's loss rate on deep penetration missions averaged above 8% per sortie. By May 1944, after P-51 groups had taken over long-range escort duties, the rate had fallen to 2%. The difference operated across approximately 3,000 heavy bomber sorties flown in that 7-month window. At 8%, those sorties produced 240 aircraft lost. At 2%, they produced 60. The difference is 180 aircraft. Each aircraft carried a crew of 1,800 men. That number does not appear in any single document. It is a calculation derived from publicly available loss statistics. The Army Air Forces did not produce it. Official after-action reports recorded what happened in individual missions: aircraft dispatched, aircraft lost, targets hit or missed, bombs on target, enemy aircraft destroyed. The report for March 6, 1944 recorded the first successful heavy bombardment of Berlin, 730 aircraft dispatched, 69 lost to all causes, and noted fighter escort coverage throughout the route. It used the word "throughout" once. It did not explain what that word had cost to make possible, or who had spent 2 years in London offices making the argument that it could be done, or that the man who made the argument most loudly was already 4 weeks dead. General Jimmy's order of January 5, 1944, issued 2 months before Berlin, written in the language of operational directives rather than doctrinal manifestos, contained a single shift in priority that rewrote the air war in 11 words. Fighters were no longer required to remain with the bomber formation. The previous doctrine had treated escort fighters as a shield. They flew fixed positions relative to the bombers, maintained station, turned back when the bombers turned back, and measured success by the number of bombers that returned intact. Under that doctrine, a P-51 pilot who chased a 109 away from the formation and shot it down over Germany had technically violated his orders if he lost visual contact with his assigned box in the process. Changed the measurement. Success was now the destruction of the Luftwaffe. Escort was the method, not the objective. The practical consequence of this change showed up in the loss statistics within 90 days. In February 1944, the 8th Air Force flew what became known as Big Week, 6 days of sustained attacks on German aircraft production facilities. P-51 groups flew aggressive fighter sweeps ahead of the bomber stream, engaged German interceptors before they reached the formations, and pursued damaged aircraft to their home fields. Luftwaffe losses for the week totaled 355 aircraft destroyed in the air and an estimated 400 more damaged on the ground. More critically, 100 experienced German pilots were killed, men with 50, 80, 100 confirmed kills who had been flying combat since Spain or Poland, and who represented years of tactical knowledge that a 6-week training program could not replace. The Luftwaffe's pilot replacement pipeline produced aircraft faster than it produced the men to fly them competently. By April 1944, German fighter units over the Reich were filling slots with pilots who had fewer than 100 hours of total flight time. The average P-51 pilot arriving in England had 350. The kill ratio, which had favored experienced Luftwaffe pilots at 3-to-1 or better through 1943, began to invert. By June 1944, the month of the Normandy landings, the 8th Air Force loss rate on deep penetration missions held at 2%. The Luftwaffe could no longer sustain concentrated defense of any single target. When Allied ground forces came ashore on June 6, the Luftwaffe flew 319 sorties over the invasion beaches. The Allies flew 14,674. The air superiority that made that ratio possible had been purchased in the skies over Germany between January and May 1944, one fuel tank at a time. Understood what had happened before most of his superiors were willing to admit it, had commanded German fighter forces since 1941, and had spent 2 years telling that the fundamental problem was not pilot courage or aircraft quality but strategic reach. The Allies were building the infrastructure to sustain air operations that Germany could not match. When the P-51s appeared over Berlin on March 6, his assessment was confirmed in the most direct way available. He wrote about it after the war. The day we saw American long-range fighters over Berlin was the day we lost the war in the air. The Luftwaffe's own post-war analysis, conducted under Allied supervision in 1945 and 1946, identified 3 decisions as decisive in the air campaign: the failure to prioritize fighter production over bombers in 1942, the inability to develop a long-range escort fighter of equivalent capability, and the doctrinal assumption that range was a fixed constraint rather than an engineering variable. The third point was the one had built his guarantee on. It was the one Edgar had refuted in a California drafting room in 1940 by drawing a radiator duct at a specific angle under a specific fuselage. The effect, the thermodynamic principle that made the P-51's cooling system aerodynamically neutral at cruise speed, was not a secret after the war. FW had published the original paper in 1936. North Americans' engineers had applied it carefully and precisely. What the post-war analysis revealed was how thoroughly the principle had been ignored by every other major aircraft manufacturer working on the same problem. The 109's cooling system generated measurable drag at every speed. The Spitfires did as well. The P-47's chin radiator was a significant source of parasitic resistance. The P-51 carried its cooling system at effectively zero drag cost above 300, and at higher speeds, the differential thrust from the outlet nozzle returned a fraction of the energy the system consumed. The aircraft that flew to Berlin and back was not doing so despite its cooling system. It was doing so partly because of it. The aerodynamic principle outlasted the war by decades. NASA researchers examining boundary layer behavior on high-speed airframes in the 1950s returned to the laminar flow wing geometry that the NACA had developed and North American had applied. The P-51's wing profile became a reference case in aeronautical engineering curricula, not because it was the most sophisticated solution ever developed, but because it was the clearest demonstration of what happened when drag reduction was treated as a primary design objective rather than a secondary one. The Boeing 787's wing uses a natural laminar flow profile that traces its theoretical lineage directly to that NACA research. The Airbus A220 carries a similar geometry. Both aircraft achieve fuel efficiencies that their manufacturers measure in tenths of a percent, applying in commercial aviation the same principle that applied in combat aviation. The aircraft that burns less fuel to maintain speed is the aircraft that goes further. The strategic logic that the P-51 demonstrated range as a weapon, not merely a characteristic, was absorbed into American military doctrine and has not left it. The F-15E Strike Eagle's conformal fuel tanks, developed in the 1980s, applied the same calculus Hitchcock had used in his 1942 memorandum. Additional fuel carried internally changes the operational radius in ways that external tanks and forward basing cannot fully replicate. The B-21 Raider, which entered service in the 2020s, is designed around a range specification that makes any fixed ground-based defense system's coverage zone irrelevant to its targeting decisions. The aircraft does not avoid the defended area. It carries enough fuel to wait. In 2026, Ukrainian drone operators flying long-range strike missions into Russian territory measure their weapons' effectiveness primarily in one variable: range to target. Not explosive payload, not speed, range. The operational logic is identical to what recognized in January 1944 and what Hitchcock had argued 2 years before that. When the defending force cannot calculate where the striking force will appear, the defensive geometry collapses. Distance is not protection, it is only distance. Called the P-51 reports a lie told by frightened pilots. Called it the day the air war ended. The difference between those two assessments is the difference between a man who needed the physics to cooperate and a man who had spent 3 years watching what the physics actually did. The P-51D flown by Chuck sits in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. The airframe is original. The radiator duct under the fuselage is intact, the outlet nozzle still angled at the precise degree that most visitors walk past it without stopping. The placard describes maximum speed, armament, and service history. It does not mention thermodynamics. The aircraft that broke the Reich's air defense does not look like a weapon built on physics. It looks like a fighter. That was the point. If this video changed how you think about the P-51 Mustang, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this story is worth finding, and there are hundreds more in the archive that never made the history books. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And leave a comment with this. What single engineering miscalculation do you think cost Germany the air war? The cooling duct they never built, the range they never calculated, the fuel tank they never found in the intelligence reports. Tell us below, we read every one.